Ever wonder what the absolute worst boundary your mother-in-law crossed that made you finally snap? When Jake and I got married, his mom, Linda, seemed pretty much perfect. Every Sunday, she'd bake homemade chocolate chip cookies, send thoughtful birthday cards with handwritten notes, and tell everyone at the wedding reception what a lucky guy her precious son was to have found such a wonderful girl. For the first year, I actually felt really grateful. My own mom had passed away from cancer when I was 20, and Linda filled that painful void beautifully. The red flag started small and seemingly innocent at first. She'd let herself into our apartment while we were both at work, claiming she was just dropping off leftovers or fresh flowers from her garden. I'd come home exhausted from my nursing shifts to find my kitchen completely rearranged, my mail opened and sorted into neat piles, and our bedroom door standing slightly ajar when I knew I'd closed it that morning. When I mentioned it to Jake over dinner, he just laughed it off with that easy smile I'd fallen in love with. "She's just excited to finally have a daughter," he said, reaching across to squeeze my hand. "Mom waited 30 years for this. Give her some time to adjust to sharing me." But Linda's surprise visits became daily occurrences. Then she started making subtle comments about my housekeeping skills, my cooking techniques, and even my choice of clothes, always delivered with that same sweet grandmother smile, always carefully framed as helpful suggestions from someone who just wanted the best for her son's happiness. She'd run her perfectly manicured finger along my kitchen counters, checking for dust. She'd reorganize my spice rack alphabetically while explaining in excruciating detail the proper way to arrange an efficient kitchen. She'd hold up my work scrubs with a disapproving frown. "Sweetheart, I'm just trying to help you become the wife Jake truly deserves," she'd say in that sugary voice. A man needs to feel proud of his woman. The boundary violations escalated quickly after that. She scheduled gynecologist appointments for me without asking, claiming she'd found an excellent doctor who specialized in fertility. She threw away my birth control pills, insisting they were expired when I just picked them up from the pharmacy 3 days earlier. When I confronted her about it, she clutched her chest dramatically and burst into tears. "I'm only thinking about my future grandchildren," she sobbed. "Don't you want to give Jake the family he's always dreamed of?" Jake always took her side. Family loyalty was everything to him. And Linda was a master manipulator who'd been perfecting her craft for decades. She'd cry about feeling unwanted and pushed aside, about losing her only son to another woman, about how different and disrespectful things were in this generation. I started feeling like the villain for wanting basic privacy in my own home. Looking back now, I can see how carefully Linda had constructed Jake's psychological dependence on her approval. His father had died when Jake was 12, leaving Linda as a young widow with a traumatized son who desperately needed stability. Instead of encouraging healthy independence as he grew up, she'd systematically trained him to see her as the ultimate authority on every decision in his life. She'd chosen his friends based on whether their families met her social standards. She'd sabotaged his early relationships with cruel comments disguised as motherly concern. She'd controlled his college choices, his career path, even his hobbies and interests. By the time I met Jake at 28, he was a successful engineer who couldn't choose a restaurant for dinner without calling his mother first. I'd initially found his family devotion charming. My own childhood had been chaotic with parents who divorced messily when I was 15 and spent more time fighting than nurturing. Jake's obvious love for his mother seemed like proof of his capacity for loyalty and commitment. I was too naive to recognize the difference between healthy family bonds and psychological control. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning 6 months later. I was working from home, catching up on patient charts, when I heard our front door open with a loud creak. Linda walked in without knocking, carrying industrial cleaning supplies and a heavy toolbox. She'd obviously made copies of our keys without telling us. "Surprise, darling," she announced cheerfully. "I'm completely redecorating your bedroom today. That awful gray paint color is so dreary and depressing." I found her systematically, pulling down our wedding photos and carefully replacing them with old family pictures that somehow didn't include me anywhere. She'd already moved our furniture around and was hanging new curtains, bright pink and ridiculously frilly. Nothing like our modern minimalist taste. "Stop right now," I said firmly, my voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "This is our home, not yours." She turned to look at me with cold, calculating eyes, her sweet facade dropping completely for the first time. "Actually, sweetheart, this apartment lease belongs to Jake, and Jake belongs to me." That's when she pulled out her phone and showed me something that made my blood freeze solid. Photos of me, dozens and dozens of them, getting dressed in the morning, showering, sleeping peacefully in bed. She'd been secretly taking pictures during all those innocent visits. "Insurance policy," she said calmly, scrolling through the images with practiced ease. "In case you ever try to turn my son against me." My hands trembled uncontrollably as I stared at the screen. There I was, completely unaware and vulnerable in my own bedroom. Some photos were taken through our bathroom window while I showered, Others showed me sleeping, my face peaceful and trusting. The most disturbing ones captured intimate moments between Jake and me, our private conversations, tender gestures, even arguments we'd thought were completely private. The timestamps revealed she'd been systematically documenting my private moments for months, building some twisted archive of ammunition. Some photos were dated back to just 2 weeks after our wedding, meaning she'd started her surveillance campaign almost immediately. "You're absolutely sick," I whispered, backing away from her. Linda's smile widened, revealing teeth that suddenly looked predatory instead of motherly. "I'm protective of what's mine. There's a significant difference, sweetheart." She explained her diabolical plan with the same casual tone she used when discussing dinner recipes. If I ever tried to leave Jake or attempted to turn him against her, she'd claim I was mentally unstable and an exhibitionist. The photos would serve as evidence that I deliberately exposed myself for attention, that I was sexually deviant and dangerous. She'd already consulted with a lawyer friend about the process for having me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility. "Jake would believe every word I say," she said with absolute confidence. "He always has, and he always will. I'm his mother. I gave birth to him. I raised him. I know him better than anyone else ever could." Linda continued her monologue, detailing exactly how she'd destroy my reputation and credibility. She'd tell people I was a gold digger who'd seduced her innocent son for his money. She'd claim I was abusive, manipulative, possibly even dangerous to be around children. She'd use the photos to paint me as mentally ill, someone who needed professional help and couldn't be trusted to make rational decisions. "I've done this before," she said matter-of-factly. "Jake's had several girlfriends who thought they could replace me in his life. They all learned differently eventually. Something deep inside me snapped that day. Not the explosive, screaming kind of anger that burns out quickly, the cold, methodical kind that comes with perfect clarity about what needs to be done. I forced my face into a neutral expression and nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right about Jake," I said carefully. "He does always believe you over everyone else." I spent the next hour pretending to accept her redecorating while secretly recording our entire conversation on my phone, hidden in my scrubs pocket, her casual admission about the surveillance, her detailed threats about commitment proceedings, her step-by-step explanation of how she'd systematically manipulate Jake into choosing her over me, just like she'd done with every other girlfriend he'd ever brought home. She even bragged about specific techniques she'd used to destroy previous relationships, how she'd intercepted text messages and emails, how she'd spread rumors to Jake's friends about his girlfriend's supposed infidelities, how she'd staged emergencies and medical crises to interrupt important dates and milestones. "That little Sarah thought she was so smart," Linda laughed, referring to Jake's most serious previous relationship. "She lasted almost 2 years before I broke her completely. By the end, she was so paranoid and anxious that Jake was relieved when she finally left. He actually thanked me for helping him see her true nature." When Jake returned from work that evening, Linda had vanished like smoke. Our bedroom looked like a shabby chic nightmare explosion, but I acted completely normal. I even complimented the hideous new curtains with genuine-sounding enthusiasm. "Your mom really outdid herself today," I said, forcing brightness into my voice. "She's incredibly thoughtful to spend so much time making our home beautiful." Jake practically glowed with pride and relief. "I knew you'd eventually come around and see how much she cares. She just wants to feel close to us, to be part of our life together." That night, while Jake slept peacefully beside me, I began my methodical research into Linda's dark history. What I discovered made my stomach turn. This wasn't her first campaign of psychological warfare against one of Jake's romantic relationships. I started by carefully examining Jake's social media history, looking for traces of the girlfriends Linda had mentioned. I found photos and posts from years past showing Jake with different women at various stages of relationships. The pattern was always the same: initial happiness and public displays of affection, followed by increasingly strained interactions, then sudden disappearances from his social media entirely. I found Jake's previous girlfriend Sarah through careful social media detective work and sent her an extremely cautious message, not knowing if Linda was still monitoring her communications. Sarah's response arrived within hours, and it chilled me to the bone. She has photos of me too, hundreds and hundreds of them. I was too terrified to tell anyone because she convinced me no one would ever believe my word against a respectable widow's. Sarah agreed to meet me for coffee at a location far from our neighborhood. She was a beautiful woman in her early 30s, but I could see the lasting damage in her eyes, the way she constantly scanned the room, the way she flinched when strangers walked too close to our table. "Linda destroyed my life for 18 months, Sarah told me, her voice barely above a whisper. "She started so subtly that I thought I was going crazy. Things would be moved in my apartment. My car would be keyed in parking lots. I'd get anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, Sarah described escalating harassment that mirrored my own experience. Linda had gained access to her apartment through Jake, then began systematically invading her privacy. She'd installed hidden cameras in Sarah's bedroom and bathroom. She'd gone through personal belongings, read diary entries, even stolen prescription medication. The worst part was how she convinced Jake that I was the problem. Sarah continued, "Every time I tried to tell him what his mother was doing, she'd have some innocent explanation. She'd cry about how I was trying to isolate Jake from his family. She'd claim I was paranoid and jealous." Sarah showed me some of the evidence she'd kept: threatening notes left on her car, photos of herself taken from hidden cameras, even recordings of phone calls where Linda had impersonated other people to spread lies about Sarah's character. "I finally left because I was having panic attacks every day," Sarah admitted. "I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function at work. Jake thought I was having some kind of mental breakdown. Linda convinced him that I needed professional help and that maintaining our relationship would only make my condition worse." Over the following week, I discovered that Linda had systematically destroyed 3 previous serious relationships in Jake's life, using identical tactics. She'd photograph the women without consent, manipulate situations to make them appear unstable, then present herself as the voice of reason when Jake inevitably became confused and overwhelmed by the manufactured drama. I contacted Jake's other ex-girlfriends through Sarah's help. Maria, who had dated Jake for 6 months 3 years earlier, confirmed the same disturbing pattern. Linda sabotaged my job by calling my employer with false claims about drug use. She sent fake text messages from my phone to other men, making it appear I was cheating on Jake. Maria explained during our phone conversation, "I tried so hard to prove my innocence, but your mother was always one step ahead. She destroyed the evidence before I could show Jake. When I accused her of sabotage, she acted so shocked and hurt that you thought I was having some kind of psychotic episode." The third girlfriend, Rebecca, had lasted only 4 months before Linda's campaign drove her away. She convinced Jake that I was only interested in his money. Rebecca told me she planted expensive items in my purse and accused me of stealing. She forged credit card applications in my name and had them sent to Jake's address, making it look like I was trying to steal his identity. Linda had perfected her techniques over years of practice, learning exactly which psychological pressure points would make young women feel helpless and isolated. She understood how to exploit the natural insecurities that come with new relationships, how to create doubt and confusion that would ultimately drive wedges between Jake and anyone who threatened her control over him. I spent the next 2 weeks carefully documenting everything, while maintaining my cheerful facade around both Jake and Linda. I installed tiny hidden cameras throughout our apartment, disguised as decorative objects and smoke detectors. I changed all the passwords on our shared accounts and set up new email addresses that Linda couldn't monitor. I researched voyeurism laws, stalking statutes, and harassment regulations. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in privacy violations and began building an airtight case. I learned about digital forensics, evidence preservation, and the specific legal requirements for prosecuting crimes of psychological manipulation. The evidence was absolutely overwhelming, but I needed Jake to witness Linda's true nature firsthand. He'd been conditioned since childhood to see her as his protector and primary source of truth. Showing him documents and recordings wouldn't be enough. He needed to experience her manipulation directly in a way that couldn't be rationalized or explained away. I planned the perfect psychological trap, using Linda's own controlling instincts against her. During one of her daily visits, I casually mentioned being worried about Jake's recent behavior. "He's been working such long hours lately," I said, allowing genuine concern to creep into my voice. "Sometimes I wonder if there's something wrong that he's not telling me about. He seems distant and distracted." Linda took the bait immediately, her eyes lighting up with the possibility of marital problems she could exploit. "I've been worried about that too," she confided, leaning closer conspiratorially. "Men sometimes start looking elsewhere when they're not being properly taken care of at home. It's just their nature." I suggested we surprise Jake at his office with dinner to check on him and maybe catch him in whatever deception was causing his behavioral changes. She agreed eagerly, practically vibrating with excitement at the chance to catch me failing as a wife and prove her superiority as the woman who truly understood Jake's needs. What Linda didn't know was that Jake wasn't actually working late at all. He'd been secretly taking pottery classes twice a week at a community college, a creative hobby he'd hidden because his mother had always ridiculed artistic pursuits as feminine and worthless. I'd not only known about the classes, but had actively encouraged his newfound passion for clay work, even buying him professional tools and helping him set up a small studio space in our spare room. This was something Linda's rigid worldview would never allow her to understand or support. She'd spent Jake's entire life crushing any interests that didn't fit her narrow definition of masculine success. He'd hidden the pottery classes even from me initially, so deeply programmed was he to expect criticism for anything creative or unconventional. We arrived at Jake's downtown office building at exactly 7 p.m. on a Thursday evening. His designated parking space was completely empty, just as I'd known it would be. Linda's face lit up with vindication and barely contained glee. "He's obviously having an affair," she declared triumphantly, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "I warned him this would happen if he married married someone so young and irresponsible. Men need mature guidance to avoid these kinds of mistakes. I pulled out my phone and called Jake with Linda standing right beside me, listening to every word of our conversation. Hey honey, we brought dinner to your office as a surprise, but your car isn't here. Are you feeling okay? Is everything all right? Jake's confused voice came through the speaker, clearly audible to both of us. I'm at pottery class, remember? I told you yesterday I'd be home by 9 tonight. Is something wrong? I watched Linda's face transform from triumph to confusion to something approaching panic as she realized her assumption had been completely wrong. Pottery class? I repeated innocently, as if I'd temporarily forgotten. Oh right, silly me. Your mother was actually worried you might be having an affair because of all the long hours away from home. There was dead silence on the other end of the line. Then Jake's voice came through, cold and bewildered. She thought I was having an affair? Why would she think that? What did I do to make her suspicious? I handed the phone directly to Linda, forcing her to explain her unfounded suspicions and accusations to her son. She fumbled desperately, trying to backtrack and minimize what she'd said, but the damage was already done. Jake was hurt and confused by his mother's immediate assumption of infidelity, especially when he'd been pursuing something positive and creative. I was just concerned about the changes in your routine, Linda stammered into the phone. A mother notices these things. You told my wife that men look elsewhere when they're not properly taken care of. Jake's voice came through clearly. What did that mean? The conversation continued for several more uncomfortable minutes, with Linda digging herself deeper into contradictions, and Jake becoming increasingly upset by his mother's assumptions about his character and marriage. He agreed to meet us back at the apartment for what he called a serious family conversation about boundaries and trust. Back at our home, I had everything meticulously prepared. The hidden cameras had captured Linda's most recent violations, including footage of her going through our personal belongings, reading my diary, and taking more invasive photographs. I'd compiled everything into a comprehensive presentation that even Jake's lifetime of conditioning couldn't allow him to deny or rationalize away. When Jake arrived home 20 minutes later, still wearing his clay-stained apron and looking genuinely hurt by his mother's assumptions, Linda immediately launched into aggressive damage control mode. She cried about being a concerned mother who only wanted to protect her son's happiness. She claimed to see troubling signs of marital problems that any experienced woman would recognize. She insisted she was only trying to help us work through our obvious difficulties before they became serious threats to our relationship. I think it's time we all sat down and had a completely honest conversation, I said calmly, setting up my laptop on the coffee table. I started the slideshow with the recorded conversations from that morning when Linda had revealed her true intentions. Her voice came through the speakers, clear and unmistakable, explaining in detail how she planned to destroy me if I ever tried to interfere with her relationship with Jake. Jake's face went from confusion to horror to disgust as he listened to his mother's casual threats against his wife. Mom, what the hell is this? He demanded, his voice shaking with emotion. Did you actually say these things to my wife? Linda immediately denied everything, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. She's manipulating you with technology. She probably edited those recordings with computer software. You can't trust anything she shows you. This is exactly the kind of deception I was trying to warn you about. The next section displayed the invasive photographs, not the explicit ones Linda had taken of me, but screenshots showing the metadata and timestamps proving surveillance had been systematic and ongoing for months, documenting my daily routines with obsessive detail. I helped her take these pictures of me, I explained to Jake, keeping my voice steady despite my racing heart. And in our bathroom while I was showering. Your mother has been secretly photographing me for months without my knowledge or consent. Jake stared at his mother with growing revulsion and disbelief. You've been taking pictures of my wife without permission in our private spaces while she was undressed? Linda's composure finally cracked completely. I was protecting you from her influence. She's not the right woman for you. I can see things you can't see. I know what's best for my son. The third section showed financial records proving Linda had been using Jake's credit card to purchase surveillance equipment. She'd bought hidden cameras, recording devices, even GPS tracking equipment she'd secretly installed in my car. She's been tracking my movements, I told Jake. She knows everywhere I go, everyone I talk to. She's been building a detailed profile of my life without my knowledge. Jake's hands shook as he scrolled through the evidence on my laptop. Mom, this is criminal behavior. This is stalking. How long has this been going on? Since 2 weeks after our wedding, I answered quietly. She started documenting everything about our life together almost immediately. The fourth section contained transcripts of phone calls Linda had made to my workplace, attempting to get me fired by spreading false rumors about my professional competence and personal behavior. She'd claimed I was unreliable, that I'd made inappropriate comments about patients, that I'd stolen medication from the hospital. She's been trying to destroy my career, I explained. She called my supervisor 6 different times with fabricated complaints about my work performance. The final piece of evidence was the most damning, live video testimony from Sarah and Jake's other ex-girlfriends. I'd arranged video calls with their permission so they could tell Jake directly about Linda's previous campaigns of harassment and psychological manipulation. Sarah appeared on the laptop screen first, older now but still visibly shaken when discussing Linda's reign of terror in her life. She made every day a living hell, Sarah said, her voice trembling with remembered fear. The constant surveillance, the manipulation, the threats to have me arrested or committed. I finally left because I couldn't survive it anymore, and I was too terrified to tell you the truth about why. Sarah described specific incidents that Jake remembered differently, times when she'd seemed paranoid or irrational, when she'd accused Linda of things that seemed impossible. Jake was forced to confront the reality that his mother had been gaslighting both him and his girlfriend, manipulating situations to make Sarah appear unstable. Maria appeared next, detailing how Linda had sabotaged her job and planted evidence to make her appear unfaithful. She showed documents proving the false accusations Linda had made to her employer, the fake text messages that had been sent from her phone. I tried so hard to prove my innocence, Maria said, tears streaming down her face. But your mother was always one step ahead. She destroyed the evidence before I could show it to you. When I accused her of sabotage, she acted so shocked and hurt that you thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Rebecca's testimony was equally devastating. She described the financial sabotage, the planted evidence, the systematic campaign to convince Jake that she was a gold digger and identity thief. I loved you, Rebecca said directly to Jake through the screen. But I couldn't fight your mother and win. She had too much power over your perception of reality. Jake sat in stunned silence as 3 different women described identical patterns of abuse spanning over a decade. When the last video call ended, he turned to face his mother with tears streaming down his face. How could you do this to people I cared about? He whispered, his voice breaking with grief. How could you do this to me? You destroyed my relationships. You destroyed my ability to trust my own judgment. Linda tried one final desperate manipulation. She collapsed dramatically onto the floor, clutching her chest and claiming severe heart palpitations. She begged for forgiveness, through gasping sobs, insisting she'd only acted out of maternal love and concern for his future happiness. I was protecting you from women who would have hurt you, she cried. I was saving you from making terrible mistakes. Everything I did was because I love you more than anyone else ever could. But Jake had finally seen through the performance that had controlled his entire life. Get out of our home, he said quietly, his voice filled with a grief I'd never heard before. Get out, he screamed, the first time I'd ever heard him raise his voice to anyone, let alone his mother. And give me every key you have to this place. All of them, right now. Linda stumbled to her feet, her fake medical emergency forgotten in the face of her son's rejection. She pulled several keys from her purse, not just copies of our apartment keys, but also keys to Jake's office, his car, even his gym locker. You'll regret this, she said, her voice turning cold and threatening. When she breaks your heart and leaves you alone, don't come crying to me. If anyone breaks my heart, Jake replied, it'll be because you taught me not to trust it. Linda left that night, but her harassment campaign escalated dramatically over the following weeks. She called Jake's phone constantly throughout the day and night, leaving voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to venomous threats. She showed up at his workplace, causing scenes in the lobby until security was forced to escort her out. She contacted every member of Jake's extended family, spreading vicious rumors about me and claiming I'd somehow brainwashed her innocent son against his loving mother. She created fake social media accounts to stalk and harass both of us online. She sent anonymous letters to our neighbors claiming we were drug dealers and domestic abusers. She even hired a private investigator to follow me, gathering more evidence for whatever legal strategy she was planning. The breaking point came when she filed a false police report, claiming I had physically threatened her with a kitchen knife during our last encounter. This forced me to spend 6 hours at the police station proving my innocence with security footage from our building and witness testimony from neighbors. That's when I decided to play my final, most devastating card. I'd been saving the most damning piece of evidence for exactly this situation, a recording I'd obtained during my investigation where Linda admitted to another family member that she'd made completely fabricated accusations against Sarah in an attempt to have her arrested for domestic violence. In our state, knowingly filing false police reports was a serious felony that carried significant prison time. I took my meticulously organized evidence file to the district attorney's office and requested a meeting with the prosecutor, who specialized in stalking and harassment cases. She was a middle-aged woman named Patricia Rodriguez, who had built her career fighting for victims of psychological abuse. This is honestly one of the most thorough and professional documentations of systematic harassment I've encountered in 20 years of prosecution, she said after reviewing my materials for 2 hours. We're absolutely going to press charges on multiple felony counts. Patricia explained that Linda's behavior fit the legal definition of stalking, voyeurism, and criminal harassment. The false police report alone was enough for a felony conviction, but the additional evidence painted a picture of someone who posed a genuine threat to public safety. Women like this don't stop, Patricia told me. They escalate until someone gets seriously hurt. You've potentially saved future victims by coming forward with this evidence. Linda was arrested at her weekly yoga class on a Tuesday morning, handcuffed in front of all her friends, while wearing designer workout clothes. The charges included criminal stalking, voyeurism, harassment, invasion of privacy, filing false police reports, and intimidation of witnesses. Her expensive lawyer tried desperately to paint her as a concerned mother whose mental health had deteriorated due to grief over losing her son to an inappropriate relationship. He claimed she was suffering from empty nest syndrome and depression, that her behavior was the result of untreated mental illness rather than criminal intent. But the mountain of evidence was completely overwhelming. The prosecutor presented a timeline of systematic abuse spanning multiple victims over several years. The jury heard testimony from 4 different women describing identical patterns of harassment and manipulation. During the trial, Jake was forced to testify against his own mother. His voice shook with emotion as he described feeling betrayed and manipulated by the person he trusted most in the world. He admitted that he'd unknowingly lost multiple meaningful relationships because of Linda's behind-the-scenes interference, but had been too psychologically conditioned to recognize the patterns of abuse. "I thought she was protecting me," Jake said from the witness stand. "I thought these women were leaving because they didn't really love me. I never realized my mother was driving them away on purpose." The prosecution also called expert witnesses to explain the psychological dynamics of maternal abuse and enmeshment. A forensic psychologist testified about Linda's manipulation techniques and their effects on both Jake and her victims. The defense tried to argue that Linda's behavior was motivated by love rather than malice, but the evidence clearly showed premeditation and criminal intent. The surveillance equipment, purchases, the detailed planning, the systematic destruction of evidence, none of it could be explained as the impulsive actions of a grieving mother. The judge, an older woman who had clearly dealt with similar cases before, showed absolutely no mercy during sentencing. Linda received 3 years in state prison, 5 years of probation, mandatory psychological evaluation and treatment, and a permanent restraining order that legally prohibited any contact with Jake or me for the rest of her life. The court finds the defendant's actions to be calculated, systematic, and deeply harmful, the judge said during sentencing. She used her position as a mother to manipulate and abuse multiple victims over several years. This behavior shows a complete disregard for the autonomy and dignity of others. The hardest part of the entire ordeal was watching Jake's psychological world completely crumble around him. He'd spent 34 years believing his mother was his primary protector and source of unconditional love, only to discover she'd actually been the destroyer of his happiness and relationships. The revelation forced him to question every major decision he'd ever made, every relationship that had failed, every moment when he'd chosen his mother's judgment over his own instincts. He blamed himself constantly for not recognizing the signs sooner, for not protecting me and his previous girlfriends from her systematic abuse. He went through periods of intense guilt, wondering if he was somehow complicit in his mother's crimes by being so easily manipulated. We started intensive couples therapy with a psychologist who specialized in family trauma and manipulation. Jake had to learn how to make personal decisions without his mother's constant influence, how to trust his own judgment about people and situations, and how to prioritize our relationship over his ingrained family obligations. The therapy process was painful and slow. Jake had to confront decades of psychological conditioning and manipulation. He had to grieve the mother he thought he'd had while accepting the reality of who she actually was. Some days he was angry, raging against the years of lies and control. Other days he was heartbroken, mourning the loss of what he believed was unconditional love. "I don't know how to trust myself," he admitted during one particularly difficult session. "Every decision I've ever made was influenced by her. How do I know what I actually want versus what she programmed me to want?" The therapist helped him understand that recovering from this kind of psychological abuse takes time and patience. She taught him techniques for recognizing manipulation, for trusting his own emotions and instincts, for building healthy boundaries with family members. Linda served 26 months before being released on parole for good behavior. Within 2 weeks of her release, she violated the restraining order by sending Jake a handwritten letter claiming she'd found God in prison and begging for forgiveness. The letter detailed her supposed spiritual transformation and included what she claimed were prophecies about our marriage failing without her guidance. She's currently back in prison serving the remainder of her original sentence, plus an additional 18 months for violating parole conditions. Her lawyer has indicated she plans to appeal the violation, claiming the letter wasn't intended as contact but as a religious testimony that happened to be addressed to her son. Jake and I moved across the country immediately after her rearrest. We bought a small house in Oregon with a state-of-the-art security system and multiple cameras monitoring every entrance. The house sits on 2 acres of wooded land, giving us privacy and peace that we'd never experienced during Linda's reign of terror. Trust doesn't come easily to either of us anymore, but we're slowly building something genuine together, something that belongs exclusively to us, not to his mother's twisted vision of family loyalty. Jake is learning to make decisions based on his own values and desires, rather than his programmed need for maternal approval. We've developed new traditions that have nothing to do with Linda's expectations. Jake's pottery has become a passion that brings him genuine joy. He's created a studio in our basement where he spends hours working with clay, finally free to pursue his artistic interests without fear of criticism or ridicule. Last spring, Jake proposed to me again in our new garden, not because he felt obligated or because his mother had finally approved, but because he chose me freely and completely. He wanted to replace all the tainted memories from our first engagement with something pure and unmanipulated. The proposal was simple and perfect, just the 2 of us in the garden he'd planted himself, surrounded by flowers he'd chosen based on what he liked rather than what his mother thought was appropriate. He'd made the engagement ring himself in his pottery studio, a unique ceramic band that no one else in the world possessed. Sarah flew out from Boston to attend our small engagement party. She'd found significant healing in knowing that Linda was finally being held accountable for her years of psychological terrorism. The other ex-girlfriends joined us via video call, all of them grateful to finally have their experiences validated and acknowledged. "You accomplished what none of us had the strength to do," Sarah told me while we watched Jake laughing with my brother. "You fought back instead of running away. You saved not just yourself, but probably future victims too." The engagement party was small but meaningful. My family, a few close friends, and the support network we'd built during our recovery process. No one from Jake's side attended, except for one cousin who had also been victimized by Linda's manipulation tactics over the years. Sometimes late at night, I wonder if I could have handled the situation differently, found a gentler way to open Jake's eyes to his mother's true nature. But Linda was a calculating predator who'd spent decades perfecting her manipulation techniques on vulnerable young women. Gentle approaches and reasonable conversations wouldn't have penetrated the psychological fortress she'd built around her son. The trauma specialist we worked with explained that people like Linda are essentially emotional vampires who feed on control and power over others. They don't respond to kindness or appeals to their better nature because they lack the capacity for genuine empathy. The only language they understand is consequences, legal boundaries, and loss of access to their victims. Jake still struggles daily with guilt, anger, and grief toward his mother. Some days he misses the woman he thought she was, mourning the loving parent who never actually existed. He's had to accept that the mother he remembered from childhood was largely a performance designed to secure his loyalty and dependence. "I keep waiting to feel relieved," he told me recently. "But mostly, I just feel sad. I'm grieving someone who was never real, but he's slowly building new, healthier relationships now, with my family who accepts him unconditionally, with friends who support our love instead of trying to control it, and with therapists who help him process the complex trauma of discovering your primary caregiver was actually your abuser." We're planning our second wedding for next fall. It'll be small and intimate, surrounded exclusively by people who genuinely want us to be happy together. Jake is learning to trust his own instincts about people, to believe he deserves love without manipulation or conditions attached. The wedding planning process has been therapeutic for both of us. Jake is making decisions based on what he actually wants, rather than what he thinks he should want. He's chosen colors, flowers, and music that reflect his personal taste, rather than someone else's expectations. "This feels like the first real choice I've ever made," he said while we were tasting wedding cakes. "Everything else in my life was influenced by her, but this is just ours." We've also started a small support group for adult children of manipulative parents. Jake finds healing in helping others recognize and escape similar patterns of psychological abuse. He's become an advocate for victims of family manipulation, speaking at conferences and workshops about his experience. And if Linda somehow manages to get released early and attempts to contact us again, I've kept every piece of evidence in multiple secure locations, digital files backed up in cloud storage with multiple access points, physical documents stored in safety, deposit boxes in 3 different banks. I have a network of other survivors who will support each other if any of our abusers attempt to reestablish contact. I know exactly how to build an airtight legal case. I have contacts in law enforcement who understand the seriousness of stalking and harassment crimes. I have lawyers who specialize in restraining orders and victim protection, and I'm no longer afraid to use every weapon in my arsenal to protect what matters most. The scared, confused woman who once let her mother-in-law walk all over her privacy and dignity is completely gone. In her place stands someone who knows her worth, who sets iron boundaries, and who will go to any lengths necessary to protect the people she loves. Some people in Jake's extended family still call me vindictive and cruel for sending Linda to prison instead of just cutting contact and moving away quietly. They argue that family problems should be handled privately, that involving the legal system was an overreaction to what they see as typical mother-in-law boundary issues. But I call it justice, served exactly as it should be. Linda spent years systematically terrorizing young women who only wanted to love her son and be welcomed into the family. She destroyed meaningful relationships and caused lasting psychological damage to multiple victims who trusted her. She committed serious crimes and would have continued escalating her behavior if she hadn't been stopped. Jake deserves a mother who loves him without conditions, who wants him to be genuinely happy, even when it means sharing him with someone else. Since Linda proved incapable of being that kind of person, she permanently lost the right to be any kind of person in his life. The last I heard through Jake's cousin is that Linda is telling anyone in prison who will listen that I'm a manipulative witch who cast some kind of spell to steal her precious son away from his loving family. She's probably right about the witch part, though. I definitely cast a spell, the kind that makes toxic, abusive mothers-in-law disappear forever behind bars where they can't hurt anyone else. And I'm not even slightly sorry about any of it.